chairs here up front. It's not school. Sit up front.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. Tonight we really have a fascinating event. The bookstore, Poisoned Pen, is a full-service bookstore, but we specialize in mysteries, thrillers, literature, general fiction. But I don't think any of the writers could come up with a story like this. This is a fantastic story. And as a history buff, it's amazing how, when they say history repeats itself, well, there are things in this particular story that are just current, really. Anyway, before we get into that, Chris DeRose is the author. He is a New York Times best-selling author of Spangled Scandal, The President's War, Congressman Lincoln, and Founding Rivals. And he was formerly the senior litigation counsel for the Arizona Attorney General, a professor of constitutional and international law, and a clerk for the Superior Court of Maricopa County. And he's also on the board of directors of the Abraham Lincoln Association and the board of scholarly advisors, not just advisors, but scholarly advisors for President Lincoln's cottage in Washington, D.C. So you're busy. The book again is Spangled Scandal. It's a story, true story that takes place just prior to the Civil War. So all of that is going on at the time. All of the causes of the Civil War are front and center. But there's an amazing amount of other stuff that's going on. In this particular era, Buchanan is president. He's listed on all historical polls by all historians as the worst president consistently. It's pre-Civil War. There was the Missouri Compromise. There's corruptions at all levels. There are newspaper rags. And we think of those today, compared to some of the stuff that went on 150 years ago, they're minor. In fact, one of the quotes in the book is one of the publishers of the magazine realizes the only way he makes money is to blackmail people. There are brothels in every town and every city in America. And the telegraph gets invented. And breaking news starts, really, compared to what it was. And that's the general feeling at the time. And then this event happens. And I'd like Chris just to give you an overview of the story of what happens and how it becomes such a scandal.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. Am I okay without the microphone?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, perfect. So I learned about this story while I was writing my last book, which was about the 5 former presidents who lived to see the American Civil War. And I'm going through the letters and diaries of these former presidents, and they are appropriately concerned with all the problems going on in America in 1859, all the things leading up to the Civil War. And then all of a sudden, the level of seriousness in their letters and diaries turns from these important public events to the Sickles affair. And I thought to myself, what could be so important to take their eyes off of the country coming apart at the seams? I need to go read about the Sickles affair. And then I got into it and I said, okay, that's a pretty good story. So it was about a congressman who murders the U.S. attorney, the chief federal prosecutor for Washington, D.C., in front of the White House in broad daylight on Sunday in 1859 for having an affair with his wife. And you have a 20-day trial that follows in an era where most trials, even homicide trials, could be settled in an afternoon. And you have, for the very first time, saturation news coverage of an event. So you have every newspaper, multiple editions of newspapers being transmitted all over the United States around the same time. So it's really the birth of breaking news. It's the first story that the country all followed together. And it was the most covered event in human history up until that point. And so I was hooked, and I couldn't stop thinking about this story, and so I figured I had to write about it. And so that's the nutshell. That's the nutshell of the book.
So how did you research some of the, I mean, because the number of quotes you have from the actual coverages themselves is a good part of the book.
Yeah.
And so how did you delve into those archives?
So it's the exact opposite problem that you usually have as a historian. Typically, you're trying to extrapolate everything you can out of a little crumb of information. One letter, one fragment of a letter, one cryptic newspaper article. Here I'm looking at this and saying, how am I going to find what's relevant out of 10,000 sources? So writing history is like building a house. You start with the foundation. The foundation are the words of the people involved. So their letters, their diaries. In this case, I find it very helpful to have a trial transcript where you have people actually testifying and having all of those words preserved, recalling and recounting conversations. I never had that sort of access to the people I was writing about with my previous books. So you start with the basics, the words of the people themselves, their letters and diaries, and then you move on to secondary sources. You have newspapers, which you had correspondence from all over the world. I found newspaper articles in Hawaii before it was before it was part of the United States. In Bermuda, I tried to get a translation for a German language book that was written by the German correspondent. Multiple papers in London provided daily coverage of the event, and in France. And so I had no shortage of accounts for this case because the world was just as fascinated as we are with the story.
And it's amazing, it started with an anonymous letter.
Yeah.
That we'll get into later as about the affair. Although in reading the book, it seemed the only one in Washington, D.C. who did know about the affair was the congressman.
Yeah, Daniel Sickles was. He said he was the last to know, and he was not far off.
And in researching, did you really think that he didn't know?
I think he had no idea, and there was an incident that this killing almost happened a year earlier. So Teresa, his wife, had a stalker, and in the process of stalking Teresa, he finds out that she's having an affair with Barton Key, and this young man, Stephen Beekman, starts gossiping about it. He finds himself summoned to the Sickles house, and in the presence of Daniel Sickles, who is not a guy you want to get on the wrong side of. And Sickles says, "What are you saying around town about my wife and Barton Key?" And Beekman backpedals. He says, "I really just didn't say anything." And so he backs down, and for Sickles, the matter is settled. And so a year later, when he gets this letter we're talking about, he doesn't believe it, and he doesn't believe it. He launches a very thorough investigation. He refuses to believe it until he can't disbelieve it anymore.
And it's proven to be true.
Yeah, it's a very thorough investigation. So I guess this is probably a good segue into talking about the letter.
Okay, one thing I want to just mention, Barton Key is the son of Francis Scott Key. So he's just not an unknown.
Yeah,
even
he's
though
American royalty.
Yeah, he's considered and the most handsome man in Washington.
And the most handsome man in Washington. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm gonna use this mic because we're also filming it for. Is it working?
Yeah, that was working.
Okay. So Key's American royalty. He's also the chief federal prosecutor for the District of Columbia, and as a lot of the newspaper accounts pointed out, considered the handsomest man in Washington.
So we get back to the letter now, the anonymous letter.
Yeah. And so actually I think that's one of a number of reasons why Poisoned Pen is the perfect bookstore to launch this book. Because Poisoned Pen sounds like something like James Bond might use to kill somebody. But a poisoned pen is a letter that's written to stir up trouble, right? It's a poisoned pen. It is a letter that is written to cause problems. And so Barton Key gets he also got a letter, but the trouble all starts, Sickles is on top of the world, or so he thinks, He's got the most beautiful wife. They're at the top of the social ladder in Washington, D.C. He's a close friend of the President of the United States and a confidant. And when James Buchanan was serving as ambassador to the United Kingdom, Sickles went as his aide to the United Kingdom. And so he's very close to the President. He's a congressman from the major metropolis, commercial media center of the United States, New York City. And all is well, and he gets a letter on Thursday evening at one of his parties, and I'll read it to you. Dear Sir, with deep regret I enclose to your address the few lines, but an indispensable duty compels me to do so, seeing that you are greatly imposed upon. There is a fellow, I may say, for he is not a gentleman by any means, by the name of Philip Barton Key, and I believe the district attorney, who rents the house of a man by the name of John Gray, situated on 15th Street between K and L. Those of you familiar with Washington, D.C., this is the old Washington Post building, where the old Washington Post building is now. For no other purpose than to meet your wife, Mrs. Sickles. He hangs a string out the window as a signal to her that he is in, and leaves the door unfastened as she walks in, and, sir, I do assure you, he has as much the use of your wife as you have. With these few hints, I leave the rest for you to imagine. Most respectfully, your friend, RPG. I do not know what RPG thought he was leaving to the imagination. And so Sickles is so specific. And so Sickles says, I have to launch an investigation. I trust my wife, I trust Key, but I have to find out. This is so specific. If you look up the word henchman in the dictionary, you might find a picture of the guy he goes to next, George Woolridge. So George Woolridge, he looks like a henchman. He's guy wears a bowler hat. He has a big, thick mustache. He has a massive upper body because he walks on crutches. He had infantile paralysis, so his legs don't work very well. So he's got this massive upper body, and really interesting.
Also in criminal record.
Oh, terrific career. So he grew up to manage a saloon that was frequented by Tammany Hall politicians and a brothel, and he started a newspaper. And he is the aforementioned newspaper publisher who realized there was more money in blackmail than selling papers. So he would hear rumors in the brothels and in the saloons, and he would approach people and say, hey, what's it worth to you for this not to appear in the newspaper? And so this finally, of course, catches up to him. He gets into trouble, and he decides to go to Europe as the manager of the first minstrel group in American history, the Virginia Serenaders. And he reappears in Albany years later as the doorman for the New York Assembly, where he becomes friends with State Senator Daniel Sickles. And so when Sickles goes to Washington, he brings Woolridge with him as a clerk in the map room of the House of Representatives. And so he goes to Woolridge. Woolridge is the guy he can trust in this city where he's really not that familiar with everyone yet. And so Woolridge launches an investigation. And this neighborhood where they're having this affair, I can tell you, they may have thought they were being very discreet. You know, sometimes really prominent people, they don't see the workers and the servants and the working class, but the working class can see them. And it is the talk of the neighborhood that these two rich people show up and go into this house for an hour and come out once or twice or 3 times a week. So everyone's glad to talk to him about it too, including the neighborhood busybody, Nancy Brown, who's one of my favorite characters to write in this book. She ends up giving very, very memorable testimony at trial. And so, yep, definitely Key. The woman who comes in with him is always the same woman, but she covers her face. And what he's able to do is able to get a description of her clothing. And it's that description of her clothing that prevents Sickles from being able to deny the reality in front of his face any further.
In addition to that, she had a carriage driver who worked for the family. He was the one taking her to the meetings.
Yeah, in some cases, he wondered, well, this is great. I got this great job with the Sickles family. We really seem to see Barton Key everywhere we go. We went to a party and he was there. We went to the cabinet makers and he was there. We went to the bookstore and he was there.
Well, they were friends, in fact, because he was a congressman, that meant he went back to New York periodically.
Yeah, and
so they didn't think that was unusual, that Barton Key was sort of the one who stepped in when Sickles was in New York.
Yeah, and I think Sickles to some degree was relieved that they had such a good friend to keep an eye on Teresa when he was back in New York. And you know, the way to move ahead in Washington, which is still somewhat true, throw the best parties. And so the salary for a congressman is $3,000 a year. That wouldn't even begin to cover the cost of just throwing these parties. And he leases the Ewell Mansion on Lafayette Square, most prestigious address you can get without winning the White House. So he's across the street from the White House on the west side of Lafayette Square. The building's not there anymore. And he has this terrific historic mansion, and every night you could see at his house senators, members of the cabinet, the diplomatic corps, their spouses. That was how you moved ahead in Washington. But it came with a price. And so Sickles would have to keep his law practice active in New York. And that's what took him away from the city and sort of allowed this affair to flourish without him knowing about it.
And both Sickles and Barton were a good 20 plus years older than Teresa. So
Yeah. Barton Key died when he was my age. I'm 39. And Daniel Sickles was the same age as Barton, and she was 20 years old.
Okay. Now, if getting on the other thing, both sides, prosecution and defense, was an A-list of legal talent, which also added to the aura of the case.
Yeah.
There's some of the best legal minds on both sides.
Yeah, eat your heart out, Johnny Cochran. This is the first dream team. So you have, it looks like it's a very carefully chosen defense team for Sickles, but really it's actually very haphazard. As soon as the news spread that he'd gotten arrested, it was very, news spread through Washington, D.C. like lightning. There are hundreds of people out in the street trying to see what's happened. So, Barton Key gets killed. Sickles is allowed to go back to his house to go tell his wife what he did and to pack up some things because he was a congressman. That's what they do for you before they throw you in prison for murder. And he goes by in his carriage, and it's like I describe it as a one carriage parade because everyone's on the street and he's actually waving to people on his way to prison. And he gets thrown in this really awful prison. If you think about the priorities of members of Congress, things you can spend money on that can help you get reelected, the prison in D.C. is pretty low on the list of things that, in fact, when Sickles gets inside the Blue Jug, the most horrible prison in Washington, he says, "Don't you have a better room for me?" And the jailer says, "This is the best room you congressmen have afforded us." Didn't think it was going to bite him the way it did. But his friends and family members start hiring lawyers. And so by the time the newspapers hit the next day, they've already got the name of several lawyers who are part of the defense team. The most famous one today is Edwin Stanton, who's about to go on to fame as Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of War. So at the time, he's just a very prominent attorney in D.C. And James Brady probably would have been the bigger name in the country. He was the most prominent lawyer in New York City. And he was a very close friend of Sickles. And so he and another lawyer named John Graham come from New York. But the prosecution didn't know slouch either. So he wasn't a very good public servant. He wasn't a very good U.S. attorney. He's there on the strength of his political connections and his family name. But there was a deputy he had named Robert Ould who really did the heavy lifting. Right. And so, I talk about it in the book, but he really vexed Robert Ould in life by shirking so much duty onto him. But now he leaves him with the biggest mess in the way he dies by forcing him to prosecute the biggest case of his career. And there's a lawyer named James Carlisle who Sickles tried to hire. He's one of Barton's best friends. He intends to see his friend's murderer hanged for the assassination and has no interest in being part of the defense team. So Ould and Carlisle prosecute the case together. So you have the greatest collection of legal talent you'd ever had in one courtroom up to that point in history, and who knows, maybe since.
Right. At that point, it was, right?
For sure.
And at the trial itself, which went on, like I said, for about 20-some days, and which is the fascinating part of the book, they get into just to pick the jury. We think of jury nullification today. Today I think there's a limited number. In those days, I don't believe there was from the way it carried on. They were just, anybody who had an opinion couldn't be on the jury. They couldn't be, even if they would try to sway them, whatever. In fact, one of the quotes in the book is from one of the newspapers, that the people who were going to be on the jury were the stupid and ignorant, and the ones who never read a newspaper, and these are the people who are going to try it.
Yeah. Well, so the British newspaper reporters are sort of like the snooty Greek chorus of the book, because they're always providing commentary about how poorly things are done in America, how crude and brutish things are in America. And he says, if you get a jury of people who don't have an opinion about this or haven't read media coverage of this, you're going to end up with people who just are generally not intelligent people. Of course, that didn't turn out to be true. Like most of the sort of British observations in the book were contradicted by someone else, like William Stewart, the correspondent for the New York Times, who was the most interesting character to write in the book, probably.
Yeah, and there's no question. Well, there is a little bit of a question when the defense is trying. One of the items was self-defense.
Yeah.
The other was insanity, and that's really, I think, one of the fascinating parts of the book is how this part of the law gets almost codified.
Yeah.
At this trial.
So they're trying everything. So they try self-defense. There's a gun found at the scene of the murder. It doesn't match the ball that was removed from Barton Key. So the defense suggests throughout the trial that this was Key's gun. Key was known to be armed. Most people walked around armed in Washington, D.C. in that day and age. That was just very common. But Key also indicated to people that he was armed. Key gets a lot of warnings about his indiscretion from friends of his who said, you may want to be less conspicuous.
He brags about the affair.
Yeah.
Right. He's not hiding it from anybody.
Yeah. And, he patted his pocket and he said, I'm prepared for any exigency. And he also said, Sickles is a damned Yankee and he won't do a thing about it. It proved not to be true. There was a lot of media speculation about why perhaps Key didn't defend himself with a gun. There was a popular theory that he had changed clothes because he's trying to arrange a rendezvous with Sickles' wife when he gets killed. He's standing in Lafayette Square giving her the prearranged signal to go meet him at the house, not knowing that the jig has been up for a day. Sickles is in the house trying to figure out what to do. His friends are trying to talk him down off a ledge. And outside, there's Key walking past the house waving his handkerchief. And so he was trying to arrange a meeting that day, and so it may have been that he just changed clothes right beforehand. But so self-defense never was fully dropped by the defense lawyers. They also made a case that you should acquit him simply because he killed his wife's lover. And if you can kill a burglar for coming into your house to steal your things, why shouldn't you be able to kill a man who's trying to show up to take your wife away from you? And so there's just a straight request for nullification, saying this is just a defensible homicide. But if you don't believe any of those things, he's also crazy. He also put on a trench coat on an unseasonably warm February day, and in his mania packed 3 firearms and showed up and gunned down the U.S. attorney in a fit of mania. If you don't buy any of those other 2 explanations.
But at the time, killing an adulterer in several states was a defense.
So it was never recognized as a legal defense. So no court ever charged a jury to say, if you find that there was an affair or adultery, you can excuse the crime. And there was never a statute that said that this was a defense to homicide. But what you saw happening around this time is you would find juries buying into somewhat specious arguments, saying, yeah, this is a good enough pretense for letting the person go, but it was out of a desire to not see someone hanged for avenging their family's honor. So this happened in some isolated cases leading up to the Sickles case. But afterward, the lid was off the box. And for about 100 years in the United States, it was virtually impossible to punish someone who had committed a homicide to avenge their honor or their family's honor. Almost impossible. Thousands of cases are either never charged, or if they're charged, Judges would issue directed verdicts to dismiss the case, and when that didn't happen, the juries would just simply refuse to convict. And if the jury's convicted, you would have a very nominal, laughable sentence. Or if you got all the way to the end of that and the judge actually issued a real sentence for the homicide, it was the expectation that the governor would provide a pardon. And how serious was that expectation? I'll give you two examples. In one case, there was a murder in Kentucky where a guy found his wife. Classical scenario, he found his wife in bed with another man. The governor preemptively announces, if you charge this man and you convict this man, I will pardon him. What makes that even more extraordinary is that the victim in that case was his own son. But as the governor of the state, he was expected to uphold the unwritten law. It's called the unwritten law. The most adhered to law in the country, and the best known law in the country, was never written down in any cases. You never find it in a law book. But it was stronger than any law that you'd find anywhere on in the statutes of any state in the federal government. Here's another case. South Carolina, 1890s. A black man finds a white man in bed with his wife and kills the white man. The governor of post-Reconstruction, Jim Crow, South Carolina, pardons the black man because the unwritten law is more powerful than Jim Crow, more powerful than segregation, more powerful than any of the sentiments that led to the codification of those things. That's how powerful the unwritten law is. And that goes, last unwritten law, acquittal is in 1958. I mean, we're not talking about ancient history here. And this case is really what tips the scales and completely changes the outlook for people avenging their family honor. I mean, thousands of people died as a result. It's an incredible phenomenon. And I didn't know anything about it until I started researching this book.
So this, one of the small items, this is 1859. Abraham Lincoln is also following the case and making jokes about it. And he's only, at that time, a year and a half from being elected president. But he's not even in office.
Yeah.
He's just a lawyer, a circuit lawyer.
So some of the people who really love these celebrity trials are lawyers themselves, because invariably what's happening in these cases is more exciting than what they're doing. And so they like to think about how I would do this closing argument, I'd do that closing argument, I would introduce this as evidence, I wouldn't introduce that as evidence. So Abraham Lincoln is trying about as boring a case as you can try. He's in the Urbana-Champaign area, and there's a fight between the county and a municipality over who is rightfully entitled to the proceeds of a grocery tax. And that's like, that's sort of, Sickles' case is what you think you're going to do when you go to law school. Fighting over grocery taxes is what you do in your career as a lawyer. And so Lincoln is following this case. There's this incredible scene in the trial. Sickles is back. The Congressman Haskin of New York is testifying about how Sickles had said, would you mind checking in on Teresa? I'm going back to New York for business for a few days. John Haskin and his wife check in on Teresa. They find her half drunk with Barton Key, and they're sitting there eating a salad. And when they leave, Haskins, and everyone knows all four people in the room know what's going on. There's, they come up with a pretense, they invite, join us for dinner, no, we think we'll pass. And they get outside, and Haskins' wife tells him, she's a bad woman. And so Abraham Lincoln is sitting there reading this newspaper story, and he tells the other lawyers he's reading it, and he's doing an imitation. He says, she's a bad woman, and he starts laughing. And Abraham Lincoln would do the imitation of Haskins' wife talking about Teresa Sickles. She's a bad woman. Just picture Abraham Lincoln just laughing about this. He thought it was the funniest thing in the world. There's lots of accounts of him telling this story. And it's ironic because he'll end up being a pretty close friend of Daniel Sickles in a couple years' time.
Sickles actually, I don't want to get into the book. Let's get back to RPG and the anonymous letter.
Yeah. So this was the missing piece of the puzzle for me, is who set these events in motion with this Poisoned Pen letter. RPG. So there had always been some speculation. Rose O'Neill Greenhow, who ended up being a spy for the Confederacy, probably her intelligence, her spying is probably what resulted in the Union defeat at Bull Run. She was someone who was close to everyone involved. They thought it was her. I ended up partnering with a handwriting expert and was able to conclusively rule her out. It would have been a great story if it had been her. And so I got my hands on as many writing samples as I could of different people who were involved. And one by one, we were able to exclude people. The person who I think is probably responsible for this is Stephen Beekman. He's the guy I told you about earlier who was stalking Teresa, who had gotten in trouble for running his mouth about what he saw. But he was obsessed with Teresa. So you've got to go back to, I think, motive. Because here's the thing. Sickles gets this letter, but Key gets a letter the same day warning him that Sickles knows what's happening and you'd better be prepared. And so if you're trying to help Daniel Sickles, if you're really his friend, as RPG said, that was his friend, you're not warning the guy he's about to go and get into a conflict with. So this seems to me like this is someone who wants both men out of the way. And so you want both men out of the way because you want Teresa for yourself. Who wanted Teresa for herself? Stephen Beekman. And the last day that Key and Teresa ever saw one another, their last time showing up at this house, there's a man in a shawl watching them from across the street. They don't see him, he sees them. And one of the neighbors reported that the man in the shawl goes up to them, said, "Is this house occupied at the moment?" And the person says, "Yes, it is." And he says, "Thanks, that's all I want to know." So we know that's a man. And the next day, Sickles gets a letter. So I think it's fair to presume that that's the same. The letter writer is the man in the shawl. So it's a man, or at least a man working in, if it's a woman who's the letter writer, they're working in tandem with this man. It's also a letter that appears during the trial to a juror. There's a letter written to the juror, same handwriting as RPG, that says you really have to convict this guy. So Barton's out of the way. Sickles is on trial for his life. So who could have the incentive to take both of these men out? Probably someone who wanted to be with Teresa. A lot of the speculation was that it might have been a society woman who was jealous of Teresa's status in society and just wanted to see them fall. But so getting Beekman's handwriting was a trick because he's not a well-known person. Well, Beekman served in the Civil War. And so I was able to find a letter that he wrote resigning his commission as an officer in the Civil War. And this is for sure, I've got him now. And I was so heartbroken when I didn't tell him this, but I actually got a second opinion on the handwriting. It's not him, at least, who wrote the letter. So I think there's at least the possibility that Beekman used a scribe. And I know it's unusual that he would use the same scribe for all three letters. But I will say one thing I learned from the handwriting expert. He says whoever wrote this wasn't trying to disguise their handwriting. He says even people who are trying to disguise their handwriting, they fall back into patterns. And they're subconscious, and we can usually tell when someone has tried to conceal the writing. This person had no fear of Sickles recognizing the handwriting. And so I think Beekman's somehow responsible. But as I say in the book, like in the Shakespeare play Othello, if you're familiar with Othello, all of the tragedy in that play is set into motion by Iago. In the source material that William Shakespeare uses for that book, Iago has a very clear motive, right? He's jealous of Othello's position. He'd like to get Othello's position. It's in the source material. But Shakespeare purposely removes the motive from the play, and I think correctly assessed that Iago's a lot scarier if he's doing this for no reason, just to cause trouble, just to see people destroyed and see people killed. That's a lot scarier. Iago tells Othello in the play, what you know, you know. And so I conclude the section on my investigation into RPG by saying, what you know, you know. You know what I know now. I couldn't catch him.
At the time, duels were commonly used for protection, to save your honor. Sickles never even thought of that. He just went to kill him.
Yeah, I think Sickles didn't feel like getting shot himself. I think that played a big role in it. And I think part of it too, though, we don't know if Sickles would have issued a challenge or not, because Key is outside in Lafayette Square waving a handkerchief at his house, you know? And I think any niceties or protocols that he might have observed, and I don't think he would have. I mean, I think he really wanted to kill the guy and not get killed himself, which I think is a perfectly understandable position to take. You know, he just didn't want to get shot at. And you know, Key was a good shot. Key was bigger than him physically. You know, Key had tried to fight duels in the past. People were scared of him. But I think any sort of nicety or protocol that he might have followed goes out the window when he sees Key out there passing his house again and again and again, waving the handkerchief, reminding him what's happened. He's listening to his wife screaming, crying in the upstairs room. His entire life has been upended. There isn't going to be a President Sickles. There isn't going to be a future at the top of American politics. This man's taken it away from him. And there he is. And all I have to do is walk out here with at least 3 firearms. And I'm going to at least take care of that problem.
He did.
He certainly did.
Okay. If there are any questions from, please just raise your hand.
So, temporary insanity, was it kind of difficult when he had been on the floor of the Congress? Actually, like, what was it, a day prior? He'd been on the floor of the Congress, so how was that?
Yeah, not that giving speeches in Congress is a clean bill of mental health. But he's giving a very cogent speech the day before in Congress, reflecting his incredible understanding of American naval power, foreign affairs, and he's defending the Brooklyn Naval Yards against people who looking to save money by shutting down American naval yards, including the ones in his district. But people are having conversations with him earlier that day. And so when we talk about temporary insanity, we're talking about very, very temporary. Very temporary. And then, you know, he shows up. Where do you go to turn yourself in when you commit a crime in Washington, D.C.? You go to the Attorney General's house, right? So he shows up at the door of the Attorney General's house to turn himself in. And people sitting in the parlor of the Attorney General's house are having conversations with him. In fact, one guy says, you know, you really should have done a better job of cleaning the mud off your boots before you came in the house. I was like, man, if that guy knew that Sickles had a hot pistol on him,
right,
literally still warm from gunning down, he might have thought better. He might have worried less about the Attorney General's carpets. Yeah. Jeremy.
Obviously, Sickles went on to have a very prominent career for many, many years.
Yeah.
Probably lived for almost 50 years after that. To what extent did this really follow him, despite the other things that he became very famous for?
So it's interesting, you know, the Civil War really washed away. I think it washed away a multitude of sins. It was a second chance for a lot of people, and I think Sickles was one of them. When war breaks out, Sickles raises 3,000 men in New York City, and he becomes a general in the Union Army. So the question isn't whether you killed Barton Key and got away with it. In fact, the thing that really dogged Sickles was taking his wife back. That was the thing that people really felt was perhaps a bridge too far. But when the country's fighting for its life and you can raise 3,000 men and command 3,000 men, that becomes the more important consideration. And you know, goes on to have a very controversial day on the second day of Gettysburg. Some people will argue put the whole Civil War in jeopardy for the Union, and other people will argue that saved the battle for the Union. It's a very Sicklesian thing to happen. You know, for him to charge ahead and be very strong-headed about something. I do want to read one thing really quick about Sickles wrote to a friend, and I think it just perfectly encapsulates who he was. If I can find it. So he writes this letter, I'm going to paraphrase. But Sickles says he's writing about something else, but he tells his friend, he goes, in life I've chosen my course. It's not a course I'd recommend to other people. It's not the course that other people have recommended to me. But I've chosen the path I've chosen, and I'm going to stick with it whatever happens. And that really becomes more of a life motto right? This is before he ever even meets Barton Key that he's writing that letter. But that's sort of who Sickles was. And so Sickles, ends up going back to Congress 30 years after his last term. And he's really renowned. I mean, he's one of the top 7 generals in the Union Army during the Civil War. So he's one of the most important people in the war effort. So he's really regarded more as a war hero, plus a significant, if you think about the unwritten law and how the unwritten law is working every day in American courts, he's not a reviled figure for what he had done. He's a celebrity, and he's famous for his war efforts. So I don't know that this necessarily followed him in a negative way, but I think it really did preempt him from ever becoming president of the United States, which I think certainly may have been in the Congress. Certainly a lot less talented people than Daniel Sickles have become president, particularly in that era.
So that was going to be my question. The other end of the coin is, what happened to Teresa afterwards? Like her stature in society and...
So this is what's really remarkable about this. One of the remarkable things about this story, it talks about the status of women in the 19th century. So Teresa at once is denied any agency in the affair. He's described as her seducer. He's corrupted her. Poor girl, poor child. Things people say about her. But she's given all the blame. She's the one who gets cast out of society. She's the one who could never marry again if Sickles had decided to divorce her. She gets all the blame, suffers all the consequences, but at the same time, they can't even validate the fact that she's a highly intelligent human being, fluent in multiple languages, had charmed every diplomat at the court of Queen Victoria when her husband was a diplomat under James Buchanan. Highly, highly intelligent human being, but at once is infantilized in the eyes of the public, gets the blame for everything, and so the only hope she ever had of having a normal family life was dependent on her husband taking her back.
In your research, did any research come up from any of the Supreme Court members, in particular Key's uncle, who was Chief Justice, I believe, at the time? Anything like that come up?
Yeah, Key's uncle was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he's quite a well-known chief. He's the author of the Dred Scott decision, Justice Taney. But no correspondence, for what any of the justices thought about what was happening. Everyone was ready to go home. Congress was about to adjourn, Supreme Court term was about to end. Everyone's going home until this happens, and then basically DC becomes this provincial town again. And now Sickles, there's the two DCs, right? You have the permanent city and you have the people who were showing up thinking they ran the place. They ran the country, but they didn't run DC. And now Sickles finds himself, sort of at their mercy when the establishment leaves town.
You had handwritten documents, which is so interesting. Was it the fact that the murder and everything took place that got these entered into court records that preserved them? Because a note, your wife's fooling around, you would think would disappear after 150 years.
It's at the New York Historical Society. You can go look at it.
Well, but how did they get, was it because it was entered into court records, or?
It's in the papers of Daniel Sickles, so it's in his, he kept it.
I thought you went to the court, records, submitted evidence kind of stuff.
Yeah.
This was his personal stuff?
Yeah, that letter's in his records. And it was printed in newspapers at the time. So a lot of these handwritten letters ended up getting printed in the newspaper.
But you could they would be paraphrased. They couldn't photocopy. Would they copy them? Or?
Verbatim. Oh yeah, word for word.
No, but I mean handwriting, because you mentioned you have to have the original document.
Right, and so we have that. We have the original RPG letter. We don't have the RPG letter that was sent to Key, and we don't have the RPG letter that was sent to the court.
Okay.
But there's an on-the-record examination of these comparisons where they say this is the same person writing all these letters. There's a New York postmark on the latter. And so, but you have Daniel Sickles' papers, and you have some letters from Teresa, which are available at the New York Public Library and at the New York Historical Society. So I was able to get access to some of those.
I haven't read the book yet, but I plan on buying a copy today. But we've spoken about it a little bit, and
You had told me a little bit about President Buchanan possibly obstructing the investigation. No collusion, but possibly obstruction. Could you please tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, that is a great story. So, William Bonnet was a recent immigrant to the United States. He is living out the American dream. He comes from Germany. He goes to work in the United States Senate for Senator Jefferson Davis. He becomes an aide in the White House, 3 years in the country, working for James Buchanan, steps outside on Sunday to go to church, watches a congressman gun down the U.S. attorney. Bonnet is one of the people who carries Key's body into the private members club on the east side of Lafayette Square, where Key is taken after he's shot. For anyone who's familiar with William Seward and his story, that's actually the building where Seward lives during the Civil War. But at this time, it's a private members club. They came up with a real original name for it. It's called the Clubhouse. And Bonnet runs back into the White House with blood all over his clothes. Says, Daniel Sickles just gunned down Barton Key. And Buchanan thinks of Sickles like a son. I mean, when Buchanan looked like his career was over, Franklin Pierce had shipped him off as the ambassador to the United Kingdom to get rid of him. Buchanan thought it was the end of his career. Sickles went with him as an aide. And because of the problems associated with the Pierce presidency, namely the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Buchanan is the only major Democrat who's untainted by that scandal. So Pierce sent him off to ruin his career. But that's the thing that ends up getting him elected president of the United States. And so Buchanan and Sickles are very close. As far as Buchanan knows, Bonnet is the only witness. So Buchanan lies to this young German immigrant, says, you know, they can hold you in prison as a material witness. Could be months till the trial. You'd better get out of town. He said, oh, thank you for looking out for me. Yeah, no problem. And so Buchanan gives him some money, and he looks around for a souvenir. And he gives him a steel shaving razor that he had bought while he was the ambassador to the United Kingdom. And gives it to him, says, you need to get out of town. And so Bonnet gets out of town and vanishes from the record. Well, I found Bonnet's grandson. He's still alive. And when I called him, I said, I want to talk about Daniel Sickles. He goes, I know exactly why you're calling. And he had a copy of his grandfather's diary with an eyewitness account that had never been printed before of the assassination.
Wow.
And the circumstances under which the President of the United States obstructed justice and concealed a material witness in a first-degree homicide case, a capital case, and secreted him out of the jurisdiction so that he couldn't testify against Sickles. And he says, I don't have the money anymore, but I have the razor. And I said, he's in the middle of nowhere, North Carolina. I said, someday I want to come visit you. He said, you better make it fast. And I said, whatever you do, make sure that that razor, that the people who inherit that razor know what it is and know how important it is for you to keep it. It really ought to be in a museum.
But I think he lost the money anyway, right?
He got robbed in Lafayette Square. Waiting to catch a check.
Yes, that's not fun.
Every page of this book.
American dream.
You gotta
Live in every aspect of it.
every page of this book you have to read. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes. Did you find any significance to the RPG moniker on the letters?
I know. I try. It's a hard thing to Google because it's a rocket. You get a lot of results about rocket-propelled grenades, which I assume was not the inspiration for this 1859 pseudonym. I can't figure out any rhyme or reason. No one I've showed it to has been able to find any rhyme or reason. I think it could just as well be 3 letters chosen at random. And I don't know. Maybe they thought they were being clever. Maybe it's an abbreviation for something. But I could never figure out quite why. And I just know that it caused me a lot of problems because I kept having to accidentally write and rewrite RBG.
Right.
This isn't Notorious RBG, this is Mysterious RBG.
Mysterious.
It's very confusing.
How long did it take, or did you spend researching and writing this book?
So, at least when I'm writing, I don't know, every author sort of has their unique style. I'm researching till the last day. I remember once looking up a completely new subject from my book before this, right before I hit send to the editor on the last final update, 5 in the morning. I was doing wouldn't it be neat to have this statistic in there? And I found it and I put it in. I'm researching right till the end. But you start researching, and then you start researching and writing, and eventually it's less researching and more writing, and it just sort of naturally flows sort of one into the other. I wrote this manuscript, and then you at least with me, you write enough to get the book sold. So when you write nonfiction and you have a track record, you can sell the book with an excerpt. So you don't have to write an entire book to figure out whether you're going to be able to sell it, which I think is pretty nice. My wife probably thinks is pretty nice. So you write enough to write a really good excerpt, and then you set it aside because you don't know if you're going to sell the book at that point. But it could take a couple months to get it sold. So now you've left it, you've come back to it. Not as a rule of thumb or as a result of any particular goal, it has just sort of organically been the case that it takes me about 6 months to write a book, to get to a first draft. And first drafts, I mean, I'm encouraged by the fact, an author friend of mine who's sort of been like a mentor told me, goes, go look at the first drafts of Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, and you would think those guys couldn't speak English. First drafts are really bad. Some of the people in my room, like Mike and Amy, looked at my first draft for this book, and were probably too charitable in their responses. First drafts are first drafts. I mean, I made 300 additions to my last draft. So 300 edits to my last draft. Wow. So it's a process. You write the first draft, you send it to them, they send it back to you. I've had all kinds of editors. I've had really aggressive editors, and I've had really laid back editors. I've had in between. So that sort of dictates how many rounds you're going to go back and forth till you're happy with the book that you have. But the long answer to your short question is about 6 months to get a rough draft, and then maybe another few weeks to a month, 6-8 weeks of work to polish up that last, to get to the last draft. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of the fascinating things, because the telegraph came at the same time, and in the book you do give some statistics of the number of words that are being transmitted. And when you think about it, each letter is how incredible the volume of information going across the country at the time. And if it wasn't for the telegraph, do you think the impact would have been the same?
So I think there were a number of things that had to happen to turn this into the feeding frenzy that it was. One is the changing nature of news. So in the beginning, there were two kinds of news. You had corporate news, the shipping news, the price of cotton, copper, other commodities, which ships have come and gone, business news. And people financed those. They were very expensive, but it was business intelligence. You needed it if you were in business. So you had that. Boring. Then you had political newspapers that were financed at a loss by political parties to either promote or polemicize your opponents. And then you had this innovation is you had the penny presses, starting with the New York Sun, where it says, I bet I could write about things people actually care about. Tragedy, fires, animal stories, true crime, the things that weren't properly thought of as news and still to some degree are not. And new technology, the lightning press comes out. So you can print these big broadsides, and you can print them late in the evening, so you can have everything that happened that day. You can as close to breaking news as you can in the 19th century. So the changing nature of news, the business model of news, because now the penny presses, they can sell for cheap. Everyone can afford them, and you pay with advertising. And so that actually births the first generation of American reporters. Now let's go out there and find stories. And so you have all this kindling is there ready for Sickles. And so I think you still would have had daily coverage of this, but people would have been mailing it back through the post office. The telegraph was so expensive at the time. If you look at the telegraphic sections of the newspapers before the Sickles case, it's this much. It's just enough to sort of break the news and give you a little preview, and then you're going to get the whole story in a couple days when the mail arrives. This allowed people to find out, and people were willing to pay so much for these newspapers and buy multiple editions. anything they could to get the latest detail on the Sickles case. And so that public interest underwrote the cost of sending. I mean, they were breaking the record for how many words were sent over the telegraph probably every few hours compared to what had happened before
It
that.
sort of made the telegram.
It made the telegraph.
Chris, have you been approached for any movie rights on any of your books?
I have. So every book I've written at one point or another has gotten interest from a studio for either a miniseries or a special or a movie. This has come the closest, and we've only just started shopping it around. But the people who made the movie Spotlight had a very good meeting with my agent in New York City last week. There's a million things that can go wrong in these cases. There are books on these shelves that have sold 1 million copies that for one reason or another have never been made into movies. You know, that have been optioned, probably are always optioned, but never get produced. So you really try not to get your hopes up. But this can and should be a mini-series or movie. It's just too good of a story not to be.
It is. It is.
And it's not, you know, when they teach you when you learn to golf, and you let the club do all the work, you know, and I think as a writer, increasingly, I try to, this is my 4th book now, I try to be sparse with my prose. I try to let the story do the work. And in this case, all I could do was get in the way of a very good story, you know, by trying to get cute with the writing. And so I really just try to tell a straightforward story that's just too incredible to make up.
Well, some, you know, really good things happen out of circumstance. You just fell into the story, but you recognized it.
Yeah, you couldn't miss it. I mean, you just couldn't miss it.
Well, it's been around for 150 years. No one else wrote it.
And it gets overshadowed by the Civil War, I think, to a great degree. This is the biggest story in the country for 4 months. And I mean, this isn't spoiling anything, it's on the first page. They produced a play about the murder that came out 2 months after Key died. They are writing the play and rehearsing the play before they know the ending. And they couldn't wait to get, I mean, the public was not ready to let go of the story. And it was really the birth of the true crime genre. This is where it comes from. This obsession with stories that you know it's not good for you, but it's so much fun.
Okay, any other questions? Go ahead.
Peter.
Changed America. You want to express your defense of that one more time? Is that too strong a moniker for this, given that it was overshadowed by the Civil War?
No. You have the birth of breaking news. You have the birth of the true crime genre. It is at least the catalyst for, if not the cause, of thousands and thousands of people killing another human being, someone who had somehow or was accused of disgracing the honor of the family for 100 years. So it's a legal precedent that lasted until 1958. And so in so many ways, this trial completely changes America, because when the story ends and there's nothing left to write on the Sickles case, there's still empty column inches. There are subscribers whose appetite have been whetted for these kinds of stories. And we're still, I mean, this is how you get to where we are today. You know, you're blurring the lines between entertainment and news, and you are focusing on celebrity. Every celebrity trial, this is the precursor and the template, but not just every celebrity trial, every scandal. This is the first modern scandal, the birth and origin of the modern scandal. And so in so many ways, the country would never be the same after this case. You just could not return to the old proportions, either in what it talked about, what it cared about, what it covered, what it read about, how it tried cases. That was all different.
Along that line, can you now, with your knowledge of some of the other scandals, 1880 something or whatever, can you see that there was a bit of a mold or a format set and that has been followed?
Completely, and I bet you could do the same
Girl
thing
on a
if you just...
velvet rope or whatever.
Yeah, or think about the OJ case and how many of the things in the OJ case
Okay.
were first highlighted in
Track
this.
it.
The celebrity defense team.
Yeah.
And we want profiles on everyone on the defense team. What were the cases they were involved in? We want to know the personal details, you know. There's a Cato Kalin in this, you know. He's not his name. But, you know, the bit players.
Judge Ito?
Yeah, right. Judge Crawford. I mean, it's the same thing, you know?
Wow.
So you have everyone in this case becoming a celebrity.
Okay.
It's the exact same thing. So once you read the book, you'll be able to identify the common threads throughout not just every celebrity trial or celebrity scandal. I mean, any sort of. Why do we have a 3-day panel on CNN of Omarosa getting fired? Who cares? You know, it's not news. There must have been a million things that were more important happening these days. But we care about these big players, these peripheral players, people who are scandalous or controversial, or whoever's the loudest or the most extreme gets the most attention. I mean, that's all got its origins in the coverage of the Sickles trial.
Thank you very much. We get to end our Facebook